This is a digital image created by one of my ninth grade students in response to contemporary world problems class. Instead of doing the final exam as something that was just the standard way we would have done final exams, specifically because we were remote, I wanted one of their things to be a way that they could communicate what they were feeling in that moment, bringing social and emotional learning in a way that they could convey something non-verbally and still evoke emotion from the viewer. And so this is what he submitted. And I found it really compelling because it gives this feeling of almost this otherworldliness at the same time as we're all in this together. And then there's this little bit of a feeling of a mohawk that goes along with, or I think they're talking about mullets, with this idea of haircuts that have had to be done at home. So there's so much depth in this piece in just one image. And so I wanted to be able to talk a little bit about types of formative and even summative assessments that can happen remotely, regardless of where we are. Because we know it's really difficult, that you can't just all of a sudden change something that was a proctored exam and expect it will replicate itself the same way when students are at home. So we need to get creative in how we're understanding their own personal learning. Post-traumatic growth is a big thing right now, and I was really thankful for a friend who not only pointed me to this idea of gold repair when something breaks, that instead of trying to hide it or push it to the side, we want to be able to highlight those pieces in our history and let it become something of beauty. And it fit along with this idea of this book that another friend recommended to me, talking about how we can gain from chaos and disorder. Instead of being fragile and shattering during those times, what can we do to grow stronger, just like bones grow stronger through stress and tension? This type of resilience goes beyond resilience. It helps us to become stronger and resist those shocks along the way. And I see this in terms of the idea of assessment, because we can think about education like a conveyor belt. We can think about the types of assessment we normally do, and that user experience for families and students who are engaging in remote learning, or that quick switch between in-person and remote learning. But it also gets us to start questioning what do we do when the external motivators are no longer there in the same way, and the direct translation of what we're doing in school doesn't work in the same way. So it really required us as a staff right away to say, what are the things that we need to do to bring unity to the school, to look at learning in a different way? And that several of these sessions that have gone before have been perfect segues into this, the idea of getting scheduling and planning in there, the planner tool and app, using Microsoft Teams to be the primary communication hub, being able to have that type of communication with families and contingency plans for staff all in one place. Those things helped us support that idea of assessment. And I put this here, even though it's a lot of text, but it came to the point of getting ideas from the 9th and 10th graders of how to acclimate some of the younger students to be able to communicate over a device. And it started just by some of the 9th and 10th graders being really playful once they were in their homes, and they would pick up objects around them and hold them up to the computer screen and say, hey, look, I made this a couple years ago, or this was a glass blowing experience I had. And then it made me think about the types of show and tell kids would do in class. And when we worked with early childhood, my mom and I co-taught for a while, that became really important in public speaking skills. So I had the 9th and 10th graders develop a protocol for helping teach some of the younger kids to do a show and tell where they would model it first, and then help those kids engage in that to gradually get them into that process. That became a formative assessment for them, strangely enough, for something like AP Computer Science, where they were working on algorithms and protocols. How can you create a series of steps and ideas to be replicable by someone else, and then take it and be able to build onto it? So it gave the teachers a base, and it wasn't just giving them a place to say, we want you to try just something like a show and tell with your class, figure out how to do it. It was them taking the forward step and movement, and then figuring out how to make it build off a bowl for another teacher to take it and make it their own. Other things that were playful, like theme dress days. I heard a lot of schools doing these, but having the kids come up with those theme dress days, it gives us an interesting insight into some of their emotional states by the types of things that they chose to either wear, whether it was like a hat day or monochromatic day, and give them a chance to talk about those. Sometimes it would give us insight into someone who's really playful for a while and then decided not to engage in another moment. It gave us a chance and an inroad to ask, how are you doing? How are you feeling during this time? And those types of formative assessments are atypical because they're not just on academic content, but they're getting across things that have to do with communication and social emotional skills in ways that we may not have been able to check in on otherwise. So this whole thing with assessment and remote learning and data has been a huge dilemma and question. So we started to dig into that more and look deeper into some of the components. We've been looking at these for a while at our school just because we didn't want to keep assessment just as standard and normal. We know that even planning for uncertain futures and the things I've been looking at for artificial intelligence and where is that balance between the human-computer interaction, we want kids to be able to contribute skills to society that go beyond being able to memorize and have a base knowledge. Those skills are still important because if you don't have that memorized content and base knowledge, it's harder to innovate and create because you're trying to juggle too much information. But these questions have been important to us along the way and trying to determine what things really help us understand the knowledge that kids have. This becomes valuable too because it's easy for someone to pass a device over to someone else in their home and have them take an assessment for them. And you won't know whether it's their knowledge or it's someone else's knowledge. So there are a couple different things where I pulled ideas and resources together. There's a PBS video on the origin of grades, and I'll share the collection for this in case you want to look into it more. Jeff, what are some things that you've been seeing with assessment across time?
I've been finding a lot that teachers need to be thinking outside of the box when this comes to assessments. And the problem that I'm finding is when they have to think outside the box, they're really not sure where that box is. I mean, for the last 6 months, the box has been a moving target. And I think for the next 6 months, the target's going to move even quicker. So how do you come up with 3 or 4 or 6 different plans to build these assessments for when, for a lot of teachers, just using the technology is difficult?
Absolutely. And I would say that that's one of the things I felt was the most valuable for me when I didn't ever think I was going to be a full-time researcher. But I thought, well, I need to go through these data analysis courses anyway for that purpose. And I found out that understanding how to look at data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, has probably been the best resource for me to try and understand what am I actually looking for and how do I apply this information to make sense of it. I wanted to pull this quote out from The Little Prince because there's a section in there that really helps us to refocus on what it means to be a kid. And I loved this image that one of my professors from Education Leadership and Policy Studies at UW brought to my attention during this pandemic. And it was from Harvard Ed Review in 1969 on architecture and education. And this idea of a child going through these really creative concepts and it may be looking like a stream of consciousness. And then you see another adult next to that child and you're not quite sure what those forms or shapes are, but it made me think of that Little Prince section where grown-ups love figures. And you want to know what about like the data and the numbers and how many of something, but they never ask you, what does his voice sound like? What games does he love best? Does he collect butterflies? Instead, they want to know, how old is he? How much does he weigh? How much money does his father make? Only from these figures do they think they have learned anything about him. And I think this is compelling too, because in a time where we've really been trained to look at specific types of quantitative data, whether they're standardized tests or end of course exams, we're now being challenged to say, well, this isn't working in the same way that we anticipated it would. So now what do we do and what do we look for? And I think that really speaks to what you're just saying, that there's a moving target. Where is that box and where are we going? So we've been working with this and having our staff try to imagine different ways to present the competencies that we've been shifting to instead of that standard 100-point scale only, and then using things like digital ink to figure out different ways to represent it. And we have had this assessment system. I pulled up just the proficient because we want them to land at this. And for me, it was interesting because this became a test for us. Did this assessment system work, whether they were in class in person or off-site and virtual? Were there gaps in it? Did we need to readjust for that time frame of remote learning? And as a couple of the educators and I went through it, we noticed that a lot of these things would still work across distance, like accepting constructive critique, attempting to apply change, being able to produce mostly accurate self-evaluation and reflection. When students are able to do that, they're taking an ownership for their learning and being able to say, yes, I was able to complete these tasks. And in that, we've been gradually having the kids look at things like next generation science standards, Common Core state standards, ISTE standards for students, and saying what things have adults hoped we can do, and what things do we feel like we've met, and what evidence do we have to support that we've actually met those. in that way, it's starting to prepare them to be able to do like self-evaluations in the real world and workplaces, especially if they're working in a world where they will be remote at some point and there's not someone who can walk by their desk and say, are you on task? So some of these things actually transition better for some of the assessment than we originally anticipated when we developed this for unknowns. Things like being able to join discussions in class, group meetings and projects. If they shift remote, we can know if they've joined not just because there's a static image of them and they could be off doing something else, but because we can hear their voice or we can see them type something in chat. And that gives us a little piece of formative assessment to their engagement. Some of the things like respectfully cooperating and communicating with others, or accepting responsibility for actions, preparing for class daily and following directions. When those foundational skills are there, we see students produce higher quality work and more consistently. So we still use that as our anchor, but then pulled some of these things in. I really loved this diagram of who do I want to be during COVID-19. We pulled these into our assessments, looking at, are we at the place of fear right now? Are we at the learning spot? Are we in this growth zone, which would go in with some of that anti-fragile, trying to build strength, just like the resiliency, but just grow stronger beside for just resilient. And then pulled that into the tools we were using. We know Flipgrid is an absolutely amazing tool. But just like any tool, that kind of tool can be potentially isolating. For example, if you ask kids to comment on another student's work and just say, choose some students to work on, you may not realize it as a teacher, but students can have ways of being able to target one student by intentionally leaving them out and not providing feedback. Just like you could in the classroom of saying, I don't want to sit next to you at this table, it just transitions to another format online. So we've asked kids to let us know if they're feeling something bad or if they don't know who to tell. I've told kids that even if they tweet it, I will be able to see it and I can help follow up with it. So by having this as, interestingly enough, a social media formative assessment, it brought my attention to some things that we could revisit as a staff and to look at how do you reduce clicks in social distancing with some of those kinds of communications with students and use the tools to the best of their ability while working in some of that social emotional. Jeff, have you noticed some of those kinds of things start to occur more during remote learning, or do you think that's pretty much standard of what happens whether you're in person using the tools or remote?
I think remote learning certainly has accentuated some of these things, because it is the haves and the have-nots, or the I have Wi-Fi, I don't, there's a lot of things that you notice that start to bring up, the further and further we get into distant learning.
Yeah. And that goes into this other challenge of how do you take an environment where it was intentionally built to have children work in close contact with each other, to problem solve, look through design thinking and build empathy and social justice when it becomes remote. And that same professor, Roger Soder from UW, directed me back to this one, Those Places They Call Schools by Robert Coles. And I found it really compelling when I read it. This is a lot of text. I will share some of these out too. But there were echoes from this time of kids saying, this is what I wish school could be like. And we're seeing parallels of that right now with calls for social justice and really, can we hear people's voice? So this is another example of one of the formative assessment pieces for the end of the contemporary world problems. The image on the side is a microphone and different faces with voices that aren't being heard or spoken. And I found this one really compelling because this was from a student who said she doesn't necessarily take the chance to speak out when she even has the chance, but she speaks out through her art. And that's not something that we would have been able to see in another kind of test. So as I went through Those Places They Call Schools, I looked at different quotes that the author captured that they said that kids really wanted. Something like, I'll tell you one thing, I tear down this building. There's nothing to do but that. Then if I could build a new school, I'd make it pleasant-like. I'd get rid of all the desks, every one of them. I'd have us sit around a table and maybe we could have cookies. I'd have a teacher be better. She could laugh a lot. And there wouldn't be a clock up there making noise every minute that goes by. We can open and close windows and they wouldn't be stuck like now. We could have a big rug in there in the room, and if you fell, you wouldn't get hurt. So it was interesting to see these comments from back in the 1960s and some of these same challenges we have right now with COVID. Will the windows open? Will we have the air circulation? What do we do about desk spacing? And looking back to evaluate what we've done this year in the spacing in our school to try and reach those things that we've heard kids say over and over again across the years. I looked at things like Billy and his friend who built hideouts and forts. in the same the places they call schools, and wishing that they could have something like that at school. During remote learning, one of our teachers, PE teacher, said, well, how about having the kids do a Friday fort challenge? And that gave us a chance to bring in design thinking, and they could have their own space wherever they were living, even if it was a small apartment, to give them something that was not only novel but hand-built and balance some of that humanity and technology and give them a chance to feel closer, even though they couldn't do those high fives like normal.
I love that idea. That is I'm just looking at that, taking that all in, Michelle. That is an amazing idea.
And this was another quote from one of the kids in the place they call schools, asking the kids to draw or design architecture of a school building they wish they could be in. And the student said, I can't draw, not even a straight line with a pencil and a ruler to do it. A good school would have a good road going through it, and under it you could see cars and stores and people, and they'd be looking at you. And they wouldn't just have to take a bus to go way out into nowhere. This is also one of the questions with busing right now, and how do we keep social distance and still get kids to where they need to be? So you can hear these questions echo over decades. And this idea of, I can't draw, but I'm trying to figure out to communicate, at a time where people are saying, how do we make sure the arts still remain in schools? I argue that that can be part of a non-traditional formative assessment. Give them a chance to start drawing and practicing, even if they say, I can't even draw a straight line. The girl in the top corner is doing a grid picture. That's where you connect geometry with parallel and perpendicular lines, doing a coordinate system grid, so you've got math there, and then being able to look at those points and plot those points and then translate it over to a new page and looking at the details of the human face. You could do anatomy and physiology, the shape of the human face structure, and you can see that with digital ink that you can do something similar. The bottom corner picture was an example of a collaborative project as part of the Showcase Schools. When we had a group visit from Korea, I had students research the things that were possibly common between the Seattle area and the city that the visitors were coming from in Korea, then to find a way to communicate an idea and then replicate that into art. So those kinds of things are ways that you can assess kids' knowledge of even abstract ideas and concepts of things that have to do with geography and culture and social studies. The student who's on the bottom left, that was a challenge that she did, and hers was presented in the Wing Luke Museum in Seattle, and it's a film canister. On that film canister is a collection of areas in Seattle and some of her family's history. She found out that her grandfather lived in one of the historic hotels in downtown Seattle while he was working in the cannery industry and fishing, and she thought she was the only one in her family who really loved the arts and photography. She found out that he gave up his love of photography so that he could support his family when they moved to the United States, and she felt this deeper connection with him, not only looking at her culture and history and background, but being able to create something non-verbally that could honor him. And for me, that showed a depth of her learning, understanding, and assessment across multiple different domains. We're going from a place where we were, again, very hands-on and up close to trying to translate it to remote. The top left picture is an example where we're really working on merging technology and hands-on outside. So for this upcoming year, we're trying to do as much outside as possible and still leverage technology where kids can record some of the phenomenon they're seeing around them, still interacting with other students, obviously with more social distancing. But we've piloted those things early on instead of just taking a test on buoyancy and hearing and learning about it by hand, documenting and recording those things and sharing out their understanding verbally. We know we can adapt some of these things, whether they're at home or whether they're at school, because they can still use a sink and some of those basic supplies that they can find out around home. So it's a matter of trying to be creative with these. But going from something really colorful to a format like this, our goal then is, how do we really maintain that human connection where something was in face-to-face in person into something that they can look at a screen like this, and yes, all those tools are there, but it may not have the same look. We worked on remote learning with PE and had different ways of doing assessment with Flipgrid. And then I have a collection here, and this is where you can have that bit.ly, that will help you see the timeline of what we did and how we started transitioning for those different types of assessment and examples and photos and videos. Being able to have kids really take a concept like base 10, this group was working on hexadecimal for AP computer science, and I realized there were gaps in knowledge for base 10. So I had them create a tutorial to meet some of the Common Core state standards for second grade, third grade, and fourth grade with base 10. And that meant they needed to understand what those standards were and then create something that would be a tutorial for those younger kids. They built it in Sway. And then they used a Microsoft Forms embedded into that way to test those students' knowledge to see how effective they were at teaching. And that gave them feedback right away where they were playing with data and assessment and knowing that data can only give them a certain amount of information, and it helped them revise how they would collect data and assessment. So by teaching some of those students things that would cross over with math and statistics and qualitative and quantitative while helping another class, you have the chance of leveraging some of your students' knowledge to support some of the younger grades as well. You can see collections of some of these works. Some of them are collaborations that have to do with cultural studies and social justice. The top group were looking at the salmon, the indigenous tribes that are around our area have had experts who come in to talk about the salmon in the river that's right by our school. And so those younger students created original stories with digital ink with their older buddies, more challenging at a distance, but it still can be done, where the kids would create digital ink pictures of that scientific process, and then the older students would be the editors for that work. And so here are a couple more, and you can see some of these had to do with Rosetta Tharpe and Shout Sister Shout. That type of non-traditional assessment was having them create a music video, since that was part of her legacy. Rosetta Tharpe was one of the forerunners who was inspiring a lot of the really famous pop singers and rock singers at the time, but she didn't get credit for her influence until more recently. Instead of taking a test on that social studies, culture, history, music, they created videos that had specific criteria that went in with those. And this would be another non-traditional one using different types of tools. It was a setup with multiple Surface devices, and then using Stream to live stream this documentary, Between the Folds. And Between the Folds has a combination of paper folding like origami, and then brings in science and technology, things like how do we fold something into a smaller space for a satellite or for an airbag? How do proteins fold, and how do those go together? So as part of the formative assessment, we had multiple things going on at once. You can see that they kept their cameras on, and we were able to see them watching the live stream. We could watch different nonverbal expressions. The co-teachers and I who were working on it, two of the teachers, I'll go back for a second, are in the screen on the bottom from different locations. So we could have one computer that was talking across us as teachers to check in from 5th through 10th grade, and then one computer and a mobile device answering student questions. Simultaneously, if you look at the 9th and 10th grade general group, there's a group B, C, D. Each one of those were small breakout groups. So when we paused the documentary, we had them join those pre-selected channels so that they can talk with each other about a question that we posed to them. And along the way, we were able to drop in questions into the chat and see who would respond to those, how they would answer those, and that became an interesting formative assessment approach. For the younger kids who are reading Call of the Wild just before we went remote, my mom is also a teacher, was wanting to be able to take the new version of Call of the Wild and be able to help them see that as well as the book. So after finishing reading the book, she used OneNote, and she also was able to highlight some of the pages using the ruler so that you had like you would have a bookmark under it to help keep your place. But then live streamed the video. And then having captions on there gave them another set of reading practice so they could watch the words going across the screen so it would continue with their reading groups. And so seeing those formative assessment questions happen along the way, you could see the kids' engagement and how they were talking about it and the things that they were seeing and learning. Those were 2nd, 3rd, and 4th graders in that group. And then finally, this one is an example of digital ink as part of those visual designs. These were earlier phases that they were working on before they did the Contemporary World Problems one. Some of them used various different things to represent abstract concepts, and those are a few of what they ended up looking like. In this case, they were looking at the story of Easter and how they chose to represent it in an unexpected way. We looked at iconography, and their goal was to not do iconography. So we wanted them to do something that was, you would look at it and wouldn't necessarily think Easter right away, but it would be able to tell something about their thoughts and opinions surrounding those concepts and stories. We want these all to be anchored to the global goals for sustainable development. And as we're going through different assessment pieces, as teachers, we're having them think about how they could link to something in the bigger or broader world instead of just this is something to turn in for the classroom. It's not necessarily good enough to say we have helped them through this crisis and we have helped them continue on with their academic progression. unless we can see and help them see that there's a meaningful purpose at the end of this, to give them hope for something that they can contribute in a larger way, knowing that these things existed before this crisis, but not only are you going through school, but you're building skills that can ultimately help someone else in the future. Which things are you most passionate about? And so with that, we also started looking at things like fashion design and science and technology, wearable tech. How would you design a solution, even if a vaccine isn't ready right away, to help people get back into society safely? If face masks aren't enough, what have fashion designers already been playing with like the apocalypse and post-apocalyptic fashion? What actually exists out there in hazmat or personal protective equipment? What are ways that we as humans have shielded ourselves from the environment? And isn't that funny that sci-fi talked about us wearing spacesuits at some point? So looking at pop culture and things that people are willing to do and wear, having them come up with a specific intended audience, an idea for creating a business starting from scratch, working as they're a remote team trying to develop this, was a huge challenge over distance, but it really gave them work-life skills and really delving into what would happen if you started a new business and how would you research those component parts. We do have 2 videos that show the things that worked and one that said everything that fell apart and didn't work across time and what they learned from that. So that became a larger formative assessment, from everything from writing resumes to practicing interviewing across distance to taking on different roles of project management, designers, manufacturing, researchers, and then the people who are in the technology departments. And I wanted to bring it back to this of looking at the developers, students, coaching, assessment environments, and teachers. As a Microsoft Innovative Educator expert and as part of the Showcase Schools program, this has really helped us develop this kind of interaction. We've had direct access to some of the developers in Microsoft that we wouldn't have had otherwise. They really do listen to the kids in the classroom. They really do listen to teachers. They want to make the tools usable and the best possible. So it's not just for the classroom in a K-12 solution or college or university, but something that these young people can see and use in a corporate setting, in their own personal business, in their life to help organize and plan if they decide to be a stay-at-home parent. And all of those pieces together help inform professional development, help us inform that kind of multimodal assessment that hits on different types of, whether they're more visual and drawing or whether they take standard tests really well. There are multiple modes of assessing that learning. Looking at the environment, yes, it's changing drastically around us, but there's still ways to have assessment that can help us understand their knowledge and what they're struggling with and what they need to work towards. That also works in with that motivation theory piece, because if kids are at a point right now where the only way that they've been motivated is by a quantitative number and their self-worth and identity has been reduced to that, all of a sudden, if that's removed and they hear adults saying, well, you'll either get an A or an F, it's just automatic. The kids who tried really hard and their identity was built in that all of a sudden go, well, what's the point? Why did I put myself through all this work for nothing? And those who are saying, well, I didn't need the effort anywhere, like, yes, this doesn't mean anything. And it starts getting kids to question, well, what's the point with any of this? It gets teachers to question, what's the point? So if we can create something that helps support motivation that becomes more authentic instead of just extrinsic, it'll be a long road, but it is possible. We'll better position them for being effective in the workplace when they don't have that extrinsic motivator, when pandemics hit and everything is in chaos. It'll give them a chance to build resiliency and be able to self-evaluate better. And it'll help us to become better teachers as we really look to see, what do we ultimately want them to be when they get out of our classroom? Not just for this year, but for their life. What do we want them to remember and feel like that they experienced? What was worthwhile and what was just busy work? And it's a big, hard challenge, which is why all of these pieces are blurry together and there's no single linear answer. But there are ways to keep building these things and working towards it, even in the middle of challenges for us. Part of that MIE expert community, I've had the opportunity to talk to so many brilliant people around the world, seeing that the challenges that we're facing here in the United States are common in all different locations. It seems like everywhere I go feels like someone else has it all figured out, because there's an easy way for us to get around saying, here's all the best stuff, without saying, these are the things that failed, these are the things I struggled with. So I've been trying to bring hope in that way of saying everyone is struggling with these same things. everyone is scared that they're going to mess up in some way. Everyone is hesitant to try something, or what if I ruin a child through this? But the people who are willing and fighting for this are ones that I'm saying don't give up hope, because I know what it feels like to keep wanting to give up hope, or that it's too hard or it's too inertial. But having that broader perspective, being part of the MIE community, gives me a lot bigger perspective that I'm not alone in this. And seeing things across time, back to the 1960s, the 1900s, kids have been asking for the same thing. And you as an educator have a chance to give that to them in a way that maybe no one else will, including parents at home. Last piece is, we were prepping for what if 40% of the jobs are lost by AI in the next 10, 20, 30 years. We're finding now that this global pandemic has taken more jobs faster than AI has. So that question goes back to, what are the pieces that we're helping them prepare for when there is an unknown future? What are the skills that make them the most valuable? The things that make them stand out from a machine? Because yes, machines will be able to process things memorized faster and quicker in one specific domain, but your students have the chance to transfer that knowledge from one domain to another, and to be able to show curiosity, to ask questions that a machine wouldn't think to ask, has a chance to bring in culture and empathy and respect, and to want to bust through and decrease biases and social injustices. Machines can't do that. You have the chance to inspire kids to do that every day, and types of formative assessments will show them what you value and why you value it. If you value quantitative the most, that will be your focus. If you value them being able to transfer their information and show the process, that will be the focus. And they'll learn from what you model and what you see as valuable in their lives. So I'd like to end there.
Wow. That certainly gives you a lot to think about, Michelle. Thank you so much for all of that. I mean, I'm reflecting on school, reflecting on the kids, reflecting on finding that box. You are amazing.
Thank you.
Talk to me a little bit about your MIE experiences. If there was one thing that you look back on and said, that is what the MIE program means to me, what would it be?
Ooh, that's hard to do just one. I'm going to combine this one. I never thought I would have the opportunity to talk with Satya in person. And that happened because of the MIE program. It happened because there was a room where they said, hey, there's some developers, go talk to them. And I didn't know who those people were. And I talked to Chris Prattley at that time and said, do you know how amazing Sway is? Look at all these things on here. This is what I love about it. And he goes, yes, I developed it. And I was like, oh, a little bit embarrassed. And then I pulled out a video for the innovation of future technologies. Have you seen this video? And he goes, yes, I helped with this and this. And I was like, oh. And he said, I would love you to be able to talk to some of the developers about what you're seeing in this. And one thing led to another. And he asked if I had availability to speak with a group of people. I didn't know who it was at the time, but it gave me a chance to speak directly to him and to his executive team. What I valued about that the most was being able to hear how deeply Satya cared again about education, that I was only supposed to have a few minutes to talk, but he asked such deep, thought-provoking questions that experience, along with people like Robin, who really value educators, kept me going with this program, even through times that I felt like things outside or in school were overwhelming or hard to deal with just because of some of the challenges. That community kept bringing me back because I saw how much they deeply valued the kids and how deeply that impacted kids who were maybe not feeling accepted by family members or peers, and they saw someone in a corporation, saw them, heard them, applied their ideas and put it into practice, and I saw the impact it had on them. So for me, that's something that really encapsulates that whole process and community, that it gives you a chance to have voice in a way that you might not otherwise. It gives you a chance to see how you could fit in an organization, even a field trip to the Microsoft campus. One of the girls was like, I really don't like technology, but we came up to one of the receptionists and she was so welcoming to the kids. She came over to me and whispered to me, she goes, that's the job I want. She made me feel important. She made me feel like I belonged here, and I want the job that she has.
You've been listening to the TeacherCast Educational Network, hosted by Jeff Bradbury. Please reach out to the show with all of your questions on Twitter @TeacherCast or online at www.teachercast.net. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss any future episodes. And please take a moment to write a review in the App Store.